morning, good evening, depending on where you are. And so good to see some familiar faces and lots of new faces as well. It's really incredible that we are all able to join here today for this very critical and important discussion with our experts, our Ukrainian alumni from both sides of the ocean. And I will just briefly introduce myself and our programs. I'm Jessica Zahovich, Director of Fulbright Ukraine. Our wonderful staff of 10 is both in Ukraine and Poland right now. We are still, very much engaged with all of our programs, and we are in the cycles right now of applications. So I encourage any of you who are interested or considering to apply for Fulbright Ukraine. Both our scholar program and our student program are very active right now. Our student deadline is June 30th, and our scholars deadline is not until October. We hope today's discussion will be the first of many and by no means a conclusion to the question of genocide, what it is. It is, an incredible moment to be having this discussion, and in the 21st century, a miracle that we can unite and engage our experts and also our voices as academic freedom and freedom of speech being very important tools against the repetition or the spread of genocide globally. So I would like to thank all of you here and encourage you to ask questions and to put your notes into the chat, and also to follow up with us after our discussion with ideas for further discussion and collaboration and dialogue around this incredible and important question and open debate. So without further ado, I would like to turn over the screen to Christina Hook, who will be moderating our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It is a pleasure to be here with what is candidly one of my favorite professional communities, our Fulbright Ukraine community. My name is Christina Hook. I'm an assistant professor of conflict management at Kennesaw State University, which is in Atlanta, Georgia. Also a proud alumna of the Fulbright Program, being based at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. We're very glad to have this community gather today. We did want to mention something that we've realized even in our panel is that we all share this core of what's going on with our Ukrainian friends and colleagues. We also want to recognize that our audience and even our panelists include our colleagues and friends who are calling from Ukraine today. So we're especially grateful for people's willingness to speak with us about these ongoing events. It's a very important conversation happening today. It can be a complicated conversation having today. And so we're really glad to have the level of expertise that I'm about to introduce to the group. As we begin, I want to just give a brief word about some of the terminology that we will be. Topic is gathered around the question of genocide. How do we begin to understand and to qualify the atrocities that are being committed by the Russian military against Ukraine and Ukrainians today? So this is a complex term, as many of you know, because it is used by a variety of professionals from civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, legislators, lawyers, academics, politicians. And so as we gather this conversation together, three of the terms that we often use in this context, I was asked to just give a very brief, obviously not a comprehensive, but a very brief definition of things like war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And this is a very relevant conversation. I noticed that just yesterday it was announced that the International Criminal Court is sending its largest ever delegation to investigate the crimes that we are seeing in the news, that we are certain to gather more evidence about in the future. And so for the sort of non-legal specialist in the audience, perhaps some of this terminology will be a helpful starting place as our conversation will then get into the nuances. So when we speak about war crimes, one definition is proposed by the International Committee of the Red Cross. It is Rule 156. War crimes are serious violations of international humanitarian law, and they occur in the state of armed conflict. The Rome Statute lists numerous acts that may constitute war crimes, including attacks on civilians, forcibly recruiting and using child soldiers, and the destruction of educational and religious institutions. So as those of us who follow Ukraine, we see some shades of familiarity there with what we see. Crimes against humanity, and as defined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, are generally crimes against humanities are, quote, any of the following acts when committed as part of the widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. These can include murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, imprisonment, torture, rape, or other gender-based or sex crimes, group-based persecution, and forced disappearances. And then finally, genocide, and I'll say the briefest word here because this is what our panelists will begin to discuss today. But genocide, to begin our conversation, is generally where we begin to discuss group-based violence for the purpose, not just of killing large numbers of people, but explicitly targeting that group on the basis of their membership. I'll leave the nuances there to our panelists, but we thought it would just be helpful to kind of bring these things up because in a case, including Ukraine, it's often discussed whether these types of crimes are all occurring concurrently. So it's not exactly one or the other, but sometimes it's a mixture of all of them under discussion. So without further ado, I can't wait to get to this panel. I'm going to introduce our four panelists one after another. They'll provide some brief opening remarks. We'll sort of set up our discussion, and after that, we'll begin to go through questions from our audience. We do invite you at any point to drop your questions into the chat. We're going to be monitoring those, and after our panelists provide their introductory remarks, we'll begin to go through these in the order that we're receiving them. So please do drop your questions in the chat. Without further ado, I'm really delighted to introduce our first distinguished panelist, which is Professor Roman Serbyn. He is a Professor Emeritus of Russian and Eastern European History at the University of Québec at Montréal. He is an expert on Ukraine and is well known for his books and many articles about Ukrainian history, particularly the Holodomor. He has an illustrious background that I think many of us are familiar with. Just a few sentences here. He received his PhD in history at McGill University in 1975. He studied at McGill, the University of Sorbonne in Paris, the University of Toronto, the University of Montreal. He is presently retired, but most of us wouldn't even realize this because he continues to be very active in various historical topics, including by attending historical and academic conferences in North America and Europe. He is the founder and was an editor of Holodomor Studies, a semi-annual academic journal. This was the first academic journal specifically dealing with the study of the 1932-1933 famine. He is a member of many professional organizations. These include the Shevchenko Scientific Society, the Canadian Association of Slavists, the Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Sciences, and has received numerous medals, honors, and special recognition for his historical research. He has done groundbreaking and pioneering research on the Holodomor, as I mentioned, and has introduced the analysis of the Holodomor as a genocide. So without further ado, Professor Serbyn, I'd like to turn things over to you to introduce our conversation today.
Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the introduction, Christina. I also like to thank the Fulbright Organization of Ukraine for organizing this session. Excuse me. I, of course, do uphold the idea that it is an ongoing genocide in Ukraine. Putin began Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine in 2014. Unidentified military personnel were sent to infiltrate the Crimean Autonomous Republic and help its annexationists, not separatists, this is a false term, separatists, it's annexationists, to join their peninsula to Russia. When similar tactics failed in the Donbass, Putin subjected the region to vicious military attacks and occupied parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk districts. Putin resumed his monstrous invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. The brutality of Russian soldiers towards the civilian population shocked the world of Western observers began to discuss whether to qualify this barbarism as war crimes, crimes against humanity, or the ultimate crime of genocide. In fact, there is no dichotomy between these atrocity crimes. Genocide is a crime against a targeted group during which its individual members, the citizens, become victims of crimes against humanity and war crimes. Present Russian invasion of Ukraine provides ample evidence of all three above mentioned types of crimes. All genocides are unique. There is no paradigm or template for genocide other than the definition and explanation of the crime inscribed in the 1948 United Nations, I quote, Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. As Article 1 affirms, genocide can be committed in time of peace or in time of war. To elaborate a holistic understanding of Russian genocide against Ukrainians, it is necessary to examine Russian actions, at least since 2014, and confront them with the provisions of the convention. Article 2 defines genocide as, I quote, any of the following acts, so there must be acts, committed with the intent is the chief element, to destroy. Note, it says destroy, not kill. We'll see to this later. In whole or in part, it could be destruction of the whole group or part of the group. And what kind of a group? And it names 4 groups: national, ethnic, racial, and religious groups as such. Now, what is the difference between national and ethnic? The confusion very often in Ukraine is due to the fact that there was the Nationalna Grafa, or whatever it was called, something like that, which actually confused the idea of national with ethnic. National in the convention is more political in the sense of a political or state, or aspiring to be a state. Now, and there are 5 acts that are listed. And if you look at the act, 2 of them implies killing, this physically destroying a person. 2 does not. There's imply any kind of a harm. And 1 of them is both one, or could be both, either one or the other. Killing members of the group, that's the first. Causing, and then 3rd one, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. That's 2nd, also killing, slow time. But the other 2, the last 2, imposing measures intending to prevent births. Now, unless it is killing the unborn baby, it is not killing, it's preventing it. It's enough to separate men and women and concentration camps and so on, and you prevent births. And the last one is even more outspoken: forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now you can transfer children by removing them from one region or one country to another, but you can also transfer children from one group by educating, re-educating the children into the identity of another group. Now, if you apply all these things to Ukraine, all these ideas, you see that this is what's happening in Ukraine and to Ukrainians in the Russian Federation. And this has been in the Russian Federation, has been going on since Putin came to power in the RF. And it is going on in the annexed regions, Crimea and Donetsk, in the Donbas region. Now, I mentioned intent is the key element, and it can be shown how Putin's own declarations and also his actions actually demonstrate this intent. The intent to destroy Ukrainians as an ethnic group by transforming ethnic Ukrainians into Russians. Putin declares that there is no Ukrainian language. There is no Ukrainian nation in the sense of an ethnic group, I think he means, especially. And that the Ukrainians are actually part of the Russian people. Well, Putin, as a well-known liar and the KGB operative in his formation, uses these terms to show not what actually is, and I do not think that he actually believes that Ukrainians have no language and Ukrainians are not a nation. It is to say this is what Ukrainians should be. In other words, they should disappear. Their language should disappear, their ethnicity should disappear, and so on. In other words, this is his intent. This is a declaration of his intent. And now if you look in what is actually, what he is doing in, first of all, in the RF, what has happened in the RF, that Ukrainian life is very diminished. The organizations, the schools and so on have disappeared, and the Ukrainians are being Russified. And this is what he's introducing in the regions annexed in Ukraine. First in Crimea, and then in the Donetsk region, or the Donetsk and Luhansk so-called national republics. Well, now these regions are being Russified. The schools are Russified. It's very interesting. I don't know if you have seen in the Donetsk for Donetsk children, an alphabet book was published, a very nicely illustrated alphabet book in Russian, of course, A, B, C, and so on. And you have Yazyk language, and it showed that Yazyk, the children's Yazyk is Russian, and it's a beautiful language, and we do not need any other language. This is the spirit in which not just ethnic Russians, but non-ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, others are being educated. So you have here the proof of his intent, both in his declarations and in his deeds. Now, since I think I'm running out of time, I'd like to say a few words about motives for legal experts to take the genocidaire to court. Intent is very important. Intent has to be proven. But for historians and the public in general, citizens, I think the motives behind the intent, the motives behind the actions is very interesting and very important. And what is the motive? What is the ultimate aim of Putin? I think it is, again, genocidal in the sense that he wants to transform Ukraine into a part, a region, a province of Russia that would not be much distinguished from the rest of Russia by the citizens who are supposed to be Russified. Now, he has gone about doing this piece by piece, chop by chop. First, Crimea, then regions in the Donbass, and then now, but then he decided that he wanted to take all of Ukraine. Well, it didn't really work out the way he planned and the way a lot of people around the world were afraid that this would happen. He has not been able to occupy all of Ukraine, and he seems to have gone back to the original way of getting the Crimea and Donetsk. Now he is expanding Russian control over the seaboard and joining Crimea with Donbass and so on. Whether Putin will be able to get his dream or not, history will show. I do not think he will, and we certainly hope that he certainly will not. Perhaps he will try to come to another solution, and that is something that has been done by Russia in the past. Russia divided Ukraine, or helped divide Ukraine, with with other neighbors further away. It divided Ukraine with Poland. Way back in the Cossack times. It divided Ukraine with some of the post-World War II republics on western side of Ukraine. This is a temptation that Putin may have to say to Poland, well, okay, you can have Halychina, some western regions, as long as you accept integration of the rest of Ukraine into Poland and so on. I think for the time being, Poland is not playing this game. I think Poland is obviously afraid that after, and has learned its lesson, that after Ukraine, it could be Poland's turn to become a subject of Moscow. So these are a few reflections on the motives, and I think that it can open up to a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roman, for this first talk. We're now turning to Gennadi Pobere̶ny, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Ukrainian Free University in Munich, Germany, with a focus on genocide and colonial studies, as well as Eastern European and post-communist studies. He is additionally a research associate at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, where he was the principal cartographer and chief designer of the Holodomor project for the Digital Atlas of Ukraine. He holds graduate degrees in sustainable systems, geography, political science, and global affairs, and has taught courses on political and cultural geography of international relations, as well as comparative politics of post-communist and post-colonial transitional societies of Eastern Europe. He is a graduate of Rutgers University, USA. Gennadi, the floor is now yours.
Hello, everybody. It's quite a challenge to fit everything I have to say in 10 to 15 minutes, so bear with me. I would like to start with some sort of a provocation by making a claim that the notion of genocide, and that would be true not just in Ukraine, but overall, the notion of genocide is fundamentally misunderstood, and it's not only for the public at large, but for very many policymakers, as well as our colleagues in academia. And that matters profoundly practically, but also theoretically. So I will be making my remarks with that framework. So where this misunderstanding coming from and why it matters? Well, essentially, to sum up the general understanding of genocide is that, well, if there is a lot of corpses, and if that kind of atrocity is committed in the most heinous way, and there's most gruesome scenes that you can describe in which those people went through, that certainly constitute genocide, because if not that, what else? And that picture is very much informed by the imagery that came from World War II, specifically, not exclusively, but to the significant degree. So a lot of people killed en masse in inhumane condition. And I have to say, that is not genocide. At least that is not enough to make claims that genocide is committed. Because based on the convention, and I will piggyback on Dr. Serbyn's remark, is that essentially you have to meet 3 criteria for crime to be considered genocide. You have to prove that one of 5 acts that listed in the convention was committed, that it was directed towards one of the 4 protected groups, which is national, ethnic, religious, and racial. And most importantly, well, also very important, that you have to prove intent to destroy one of those protected groups as such. In other words, you can have a case when millions of people slaughtered in the most gruesome way, but that would not be crime of genocide. It would not be a crime. Just consider the condition of war, such event of World War II. A lot of millions of people died in combat. That is not a crime in itself. The war could be a crime if it's a war of aggression, but killing your fellow human beings en masse in horrible ways with horrible weapons is not genocide in itself. Therefore, you have to start from that premise. On the other hand, you can commit genocide without killing a single person. And to know that, all you need to do is to look at the Article 2 of the convention, just to see that the last 2 acts that having to do with transfer of children from one group to another, or to prevent birth in a protected group, is also an act of genocide, which do not require necessarily killing anybody, right? So that's been enshrined in international law for many, many decades. But apparently that is not transpiring in the consciousness of people who make pronouncement about whether or not particular crime is or is not genocide. All right, so that has a fundamental implication of how one should think about whether or not a genocide is committed. There is another thing that is profoundly misleading, and as that, again, in public imagination, there is some sort of hierarchy having to do with most egregious crimes. And if you look at the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, you will see that there are 4 particular types of crimes that are under purview of the International Criminal Court. One, of course, is genocide. Another one is crimes against humanity. Then you have war crimes, and then you have war of aggression. And genocide is considered to be, and again, in the public imagination, but not just in general publics, that it's a crime of crime. So committing genocide is not only committing a crime, but it also has a moral implication that those who commit crimes of that nature are almost inhuman. These are like serious moral judgment of those on those who commit those kind of crimes. It could be useful for all kind of purposes, except that is not very useful as far as charging someone and prosecuting someone for committing that and that crime. And if you look at the statute, let me just show it to you, if I could quickly. The statute itself, oops, where is that? Yeah. All right, so that is Rome statutes of the International Criminal Court, that it lists crimes against humanity. And if you look at the kind of crimes or rather acts that are committed that could be considered crimes against humanity, you will see that many of them are actually very, very similar under the description of what constitutes genocide. But the important thing here is that it includes groups other than groups listed on the Genocide Convention. So, or even the definition for genocide in the same statute. So that is not, therefore it is really not about hierarchy. These are just somewhat different types of crimes. So crimes of genocide, these are crimes against certain protected groups, while other groups that are not specifically listed just do not fall on the Genocide Convention. Therefore, they could be considered to be other crimes. Therefore, if it's not a crime of genocide, it does not mean it's not a crime. It could be crime against humanity, could be war crime, and so on. So therefore, we have to be careful to identify these three important factors that I already mentioned. There has to be a particular protected group, has to be at least one of those acts, and it has an intent to destroy such group in full or in part, as such should be demonstrated. And let me show you different things of how it is conventionally perceived. Here, for example, Parliament of Canada adopted a resolution that essentially stipulates that, look what's happening in Ukraine. We have a clear and ample evidence of systematic and massive war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed, all right? That include mass atrocities, willful killing of civilians, transfer of children, grave suffering, physical harm, mental harm, and rape. Therefore, we recognize these acts as genocide, which defies the logic. If you already established that war crimes and crimes against humanity are committed, that does not follow that the crimes of genocide are committed. I'm not saying that at this point, I'm not making a case whether or not genocide was committed or is being committed. I'm just saying that claiming that war crimes, which much more easier to establish, and crimes against humanity, which is less so because the crimes committed by the armed forces within the war condition, that is mostly in the purview of war crimes. And one thing is actually usually absent from the analysis, that all those crimes are committed within a framework of war of aggression, which in itself are very serious international crime. And that's very similar to what, for example, Ukrainian parliament has adopted in its resolution, recognizing these crimes as genocide. One of the problems, I'm not going to go into all of them, I don't have much time left at all, but anyway, so it's very similar to, I mean, it's much more expensive in its deliberation as in the Canadian case. One thing is that it's a complete confusion in terms of what constitutes a protective group, specifically national group. There is a sort of attention paid and underscored that the national and nationalny in Ukrainian language and the Western political tradition it's a very different things. But at the same time, the Ukrainian parliament introduces a concept of Ukrainian people, which makes it even more problematic since people is not a protected group under the convention or any definition of genocide you can find. So rather than just disregard or explicitly reject the Soviet understanding of what nationalist means, which actually means ethnic group, and to talk about national group, which is political group, and that creates more and more confusion. All right, why is that, again, relevant? Well, let me stop sharing. Okay. Okay, so I am, to wrap it up, to my understanding, and I would agree with my colleague, Roman Serbyn, that genocide is being committed in Ukraine. However, the foundations for making such a claim should be based not on the evidence exclusively, the evidence that crimes were committed, or even if you agree that Ukrainian national group is being targeted rather than Ukrainian ethnic group. What is missing largely is the proof of the intent. And the intent is conveniently, if you wish, is provided by the leadership of Russia that is, first of all, clearly liable for the crime committed in terms of launching the war of aggression and directing its armed forces committing all kinds of war crimes. And we know that today a trial is being held in Kyiv for the first trial of war crimes that proves conclusively that crimes of such magnitude were committed. But the justification for this military operation, the war of aggression that was provided by Russian leadership, specifically by Russian dictator. We know that Russia is a dictatorship, therefore its ideological pronouncement is the motivation for action, and that explicitly suggests that there's only one Russian people and Ukrainian people should not exist. And I'm just piggybacking on Roman's remarks, not to dwell on that, that it's intent to get rid of those people, not ethnic Ukrainian per se, but Ukrainians who insist of having sovereign independent state, who want to live by their own laws, not to be part of Russia, and therefore those people and organizations should be eliminated. So in that sense, the leadership is providing justification for that kind of atrocities. And that clearly to at least provide serious solid grounds for us to consider that we can prove the intent. And considering that we're talking about a particular protective group, which is a national group in Ukraine, and all those acts committed that fall under the convention. Therefore, based on the conclusion that all three elements are present, I would submit to you that the acts of genocide are being committed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Gennadi, adding this depth to our conversation, certainly getting at some of the most contested aspects of comparative genocide studies. I will also choose this opportunity to remind our audience that any questions that are rising to your mind, please go ahead and put those in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll also now introduce Professor Myroslava Antonovych, who will be providing a legal perspective to some of these questions as well. She has an LLM from McGill University, a Doctor of Law from the Ukrainian Free University. She has a Specialist of Law degree from Lviv National University, a PhD in Philology from Kyiv Linguistic University. Such a distinguished educational background in this area. She is also the head of the Center for Genocide and Human Rights Studies an associate professor of the Faculty of Law at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. She is also chair of the Department of International Law and professor at Ukrainian Free University in Munich, Germany. She is a former judge ad hoc of the European Court of Human Rights and was a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Cincinnati, Ohio, USA. She was president of the Ukrainian Fulbright Association and is the author of over 120 publications in public international law, international human rights, and genocide studies. Dr. Antonovich was a visiting scholar at Oxford University, the University of Cincinnati, Washington and Lee University, Tartu University, and other universities. She was the recipient of a fellowship from Oxford College, from AFP fellowships, as well as a postdoc fellowship from the University of Toronto. Without further ado, I turn things over to you, Myroslava, to provide your perspectives on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, for this lovely words about me, my biography. And thank you very much to Fulbright Ukraine for organizing this timely event and to my colleagues on the panel. I would begin my short presentation with reminding that on the 24th of February 2022, there should have started final solution of the Ukrainian question in the course of a brief up to 3-day special military operation as planned by Russia. The phrasing final solution of the question was used by Hitler in the Second World War in relation to Jews, which was qualified as genocide of the Jewish people, Holocaust. This very phrasing was used in the article by Timofey Sergeytsev, What Russia Should Do with Ukraine, the manifesto, the map of Russian genocide against the Ukrainian nation, published by Russian state news agency RIA Novosti, with clearly genocidal narrative, formulating the idea of destroying the Ukrainian nation. But even taking aside this article, which Russian Minister for Foreign Affairs Lavrov called a private view of the author, as if anything could have been published in state news agency without approval by political leadership of Russia. There are numerous proofs of the intent of the Russian political and military leadership to commit genocide against the Ukrainian nation since 24th February 2022. In my presentation, I would touch 3 issues. Firstly, attempt to commit genocide of the Ukrainian nation as a mental element of the crime of genocide. Secondly, the targeted group of genocide. Thirdly, genocidal acts against the Ukrainian nation as material elements of the crime. I will conclude with possibilities of criminal accountability for ongoing Russian genocide. Firstly, intent to destroy a group which should not be mixed with a plan. Let me remind you that under Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, the following acts shall be punishable: genocide, B, conspiracy to commit genocide, C, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, D, attempt to commit genocide, E, complicity in genocide. Article 4 of the Genocide Convention foresees that persons committing genocide or any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3 shall be punished, whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. Circumstances which may evidence the intent to commit genocide are different. And according to International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda judgment in Akayesu case, intent may be inferred from the following factors: the scale of atrocities committed, the general nature of the atrocities committed, the fact of deliberately or systematically targeting victims on account of their membership of a particular group, the general political doctrine which gave rise to the acts, the repetition of destructive and discriminatory acts, and others. In Kyiv-Mohyla and Ruzindana case, the Rwandan Tribunal trial chamber stated that as intent might be difficult to determine, the perpetrator's actions, including circumstantial evidence, however, may provide sufficient evidence of intent, and that intent can be inferred either from words or deeds and may be demonstrated by a pattern of purposeful action. International Criminal Court also explained in the elements of crimes that existence of intent and knowledge can be inferred from relevant facts and circumstances. It means that the intent should not necessarily be fixed in documents or formulated in public oral speeches, but may also be certified by facts and circumstances of a crime. In the ongoing full-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine, the intent to destroy the Ukrainian nation could be inferred from speeches of Putin, Medvedev, Duma deputies, and other politicians and journalists that constitute the general political doctrine which gave rise to the acts that might be qualified as genocide. On the other hand, those statements might themselves be qualified as incitement to commit genocide by Russian military under Article 3, as mentioned above. Public speeches of President Putin and his henchmen, in which they deny that Ukrainians constitute a nation, are well known. As in his televised address to the nation on 22nd February 2022, Putin explicitly denied that Ukraine had ever had real statehood and said the country was an integral part of Russia's own history, culture, spiritual space. There are arguments that in the frame of Russian aggression against Ukraine, the crime of genocide is not committed because there exists no plan to destroy Ukrainians. However, as the Rwandan Tribunal trial chamber stated, a specific plan to destroy does not constitute an element of genocide, though the existence of such a plan would be strong evidence of the specific intent requirement for the crime of genocide. I may cite other cases, court cases of Rwandan Tribunal, Yugoslavia Tribunal, but unfortunately, I don't have time for this. So I turn over to the second issue, which I would briefly touch, the targeted group undergoing genocide in the territory of Ukraine since 24th February 2022. In the speeches and statements of Russian political leadership mentioned above, the words Ukraine, Ukrainians, Ukraine is not even a state, and the like, make it clear that the genocidal Russia's intent is to destroy the Ukrainian nation, that is, national group. Based on the not-a-bomb decision rendered by the International Court of Justice, the trial chamber of the Rwandan Tribunal in Akayesu case held that a national group is defined as a collection of people who are perceived to share a legal bond based on common citizenship coupled with reciprocity of rights and duties. In the Ukrainian case, the targeted group is the Ukrainian nation as a political unity comprising citizens of Ukraine. In the course of aggression, Russian military are destroying citizens of Ukraine who might speak different languages. For instance, in the east of Ukraine, where the number of victims count tens of thousands, predominantly Russian speakers live. The third issue of my presentation concerns genocidal acts done in furtherance of the genocidal intent mentioned above, which confirm existence of such intent. In Krstić case, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia stated, customary international law limits the definition of genocide to those acts seeking physical or biological destruction of all or part of the group. Among such acts committed by Russian military in Ukraine, First, deliberate killings of civilians through systematic indiscriminate shelling, shooting civilians, missile and artillery bombing of the cities and villages all over Ukraine, killing detained military personnel because it belongs to a protected group, and this is also a genocidal act. The second genocidal act, causing physical and mental harm to citizens of Ukraine through torture and inhuman treatment, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, enforced disappearances, etc. The whole world was shocked by rapes in Kyiv region and other regions and other occupied regions of Ukraine committed by Russian military. In the Akayesu case, the Rwandan tribunal, the trial chamber, ruled that rapes resulted in physical and psychological destruction of Tutsi women, their families, and their communities. Sexual violence was an integral part of the process of destruction, specifically targeting Tutsi women and specifically contributing to their destruction and to the destruction of the Tutsi group as a whole. There is evidence that Russian perpetrators committed this brutality, stressing that the Ukrainian women should not give birth to children. It's also evidences preventing birth within the members of the group. The next genocidal act, deliberate inflicting by the armed forces of the Russian Federation of conditions of life calculated to bring about destruction of the Ukrainian nation in whole or in part, in particular, by means of besieging settlements, blocking of humanitarian aid and evacuation of civilians, the capture and deliberate destruction of infrastructure that provides for people's basic needs. Next genocidal act, possible transfer of Ukrainian children. It is also part of the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. As stated by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine in the declaration on the genocide committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine, the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children to the territory of the Russian Federation and their relocation to an alien environment aimed at the annihilation of their self-identification as Ukrainians, as well as the expulsion from their homes and deportation to the territory of the Russian Federation of thousands of persons belonging to the civilian population of Ukraine. As stated by trial chamber of ICTY in Blagoevich and Jokic case, in relation to forcible transfer, Judge Shahabuddin found that mere displacement does not amount to genocide. However, he further found that displacement can constitute genocide when the consequence is dissolution of the group. I have no time to cite other cases, but the parallels with Mariupol are clear here. All in all, citing Alexander Motel, tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been killed in Mariupol, thousands more have died in other Ukrainian villages, towns, and cities, hundreds of thousands have been ethnically cleansed and forcibly deported to Russia, thousands of children have been kidnapped, end of citation. And that was done because to the targeted group, the Ukrainian national group. All the enumerated acts were committed in accordance with Russian political and military doctrine aimed at destroying the Ukrainian nation as such. To conclude with, international and domestic jurisdictions are very cautious concerning a crime of genocide being committed in Ukraine. Before the aggression, Putin said that he is preventing genocide of Russian speakers, which is being committed by Kyiv regime, which he calls neo-Nazis, in the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast of Ukraine, and he needs to intervene to prevent and punish for the crime of genocide under the Genocide Convention. As the whole world was able to see, those neo-Nazis are Russian leadership and military who are committing genocide against the Ukrainian nation. Actually, all crimes that are seen now in Ukraine follow from the crime of aggression, as it was already mentioned. It would be easier to establish responsibility for the senior leaders of Russia for a crime of aggression than it would be to establish responsibility for individual war crimes, crimes against humanity, and potentially genocide. There are two tracks in domestic legal response. The first addresses accountability for a core international crime, aggression. In this sphere, investigation has been launched by Ukraine together with other European teams, and for the first time, such joint international investigation team has been joined by the Office of the Prosecutor of International Criminal Court. The second track addresses war crimes, crimes against humanity, and potentially genocide in Ukraine. On the level of international justice, the International Criminal Court has launched investigation on account of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and potentially genocide. Potentially, because the legal evidence of genocide is most difficult to obtain. I do not know what would be by the end of the day, as burden of proof is very high for genocide, beyond reasonable doubt. But the fact is that genocide should not only be limited to lawyers. As Professor Eugene Finkel stated, genocide is too big an issue to be left to lawyers. And I will end my speech with these words. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Myroslava, for reminding us about the importance of legal frameworks for understanding in real time what we are watching unfold. We will slightly transition with our last speaker, who will speak to us about the importance of language, including language across distinctive languages. And so it is my pleasure to introduce our final panelist before we turn to the Q&A. Our final speaker is Professor Alexander Pronkinovich, who is Professor and Dean of Philology and Journalism School of the Kyiv-Mohyla Black Sea National University. He is president of the Association of Hispanics of Ukraine, member of the Ukrainian Association of Fulbright Academic Exchange Program Alumni, and International Association of Hispanics, a Fulbright scholar himself at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as recipient of a scholarship stipend from the Spanish government at the University of Basque Country, Alavas, in Spain. He was visiting professor at the University of Montclair, New Jersey. He has been a leading researcher and a member of research teams in several international and Ukrainian research projects that have been financed by the governments of Spain, Poland, Germany, and Ukraine. From 1985 to 2018, he has participated in over 50 conferences on world literature, the Spanish language, methods of teaching of world literature and education, and he is the author himself of 150 papers as well as 9 books. It is my pleasure to now turn the floor over to Alexander. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina, for your wonderful presentation. And I would like to apologize from the very beginning. I am not a lawyer and a historian, an expert in political sciences. And what I'm going to speak about is my experience of my attempts to tell what is genocide in Ukraine using the Spanish language. I want to share the presentation, and please let me know if you can see it, if it works. Can you see it? Is it okay? Okay, so I decided to give the title, so writing and speaking about the genocide in the Spanish language. And the first thing I would like to say is just why writing and speaking, because I'm very much concerned about drawing your attention to the problem of speaking and writing. That means creating images about the genocide in Ukraine, and not I have some side criteria for those images. You see, they can be verbal or unverbal, but they have to represent the tragedy of genocide of the Ukraine.
We may be having a small technical glitch. Let's give Alexander a minute to see if it should stabilize. Alexander, do we have you with us? I think you're muted.
Okay, and I want to show you one of the examples actually of a successful representation of genocide, and in my opinion it can be problematic because if we apply all the definitions we have heard about to this particular picture, to this particular work of art, you can say it's not just that the case of Guernica maybe is not a genocide. You know, it's the question, yeah, but it is the image which is recognized like this. Just why Spanish? Because I speak and write Spanish, and then when we speak and write Spanish, we have access to a huge amount of people. We know it's about 600 million people speak Spanish as their mother tongue or their national language, and there are more than 20 sovereign states and the United States of America. But it's a great problem because all countries which speak Spanish, they have a huge variety of cultures, and it's so difficult to speak to them. For example, if we speak about the United States, if we speak about Latin America, it's a great problem to attract the attention to the problems of Ukraine and to the Ukrainian genocide, because you know they are influenced by the Russian propaganda, and they look upon the Ukrainian case as a part of anti-American fight, and their own histories of genocides. Okay, and I decided to focus on Spain because it's the field of my research, because I have personal contacts, and it was one of my main motives to start writing, and so to be involved in the informative work about spreading about the word about the genocide in Ukraine in Spanish, and I can mention some examples of strategy of activities I'm involved in. It's just I'm writing the diary of the war, and I wrote more than 75 testimonies for the newspaper La Voz de Galicia, which is one of the most important newspapers in Spain. And in many essays and in many testimonies, I address the issue of the genocide of the Ukrainians. We, on the regular basis, do tertulias, meetings with the Spanish ex-Fulbrighters, whom I see here at our meeting, and we do meetings, discussions, debates, and then we, I mean, my colleagues who speak Spanish in Ukraine, and so. And I would like to briefly comment the strategies which I use to speak about genocide when I speak Spanish. You see, first, I'm trying to be as little academic as possible, because you know I appeal to the emotional and intellectual emotional side of human beings, and then on the other hand, we face the problem that in the Spanish-speaking countries, actually Ukraine does not exist. It's just, you can, maybe it's an exaggeration, but I know from the experience that even Spaniards who are in Europe, they know so little. But just if we speak about Latin America, it's something so far, so strange, so unknown. And that's why we have to look for special approaches. And one of the things which I use is anecdote-based narration. Actually, I tell what I experienced, what I saw, what I heard. I translate sometimes some testimonies of other people, but those other people, they are my students, my colleagues, and they are in the war. And it's kind of some episodes of this global genocide which you know, we are suffering now. I'm trying to use some educational dimension because I have to explain some concepts and phenomena of the Ukrainian history and culture. For example, how we celebrate Easter. And when we celebrate Easter, we go to point 5, to the 5th strategy. You see, I address to the Christian layers of messages, because for me, the most important moment, you know, element of my message in presenting Ukraine as a victim of the genocide is comparing Ukraine to Jesus Christ, because it's a scapegoat, actually, yeah. And I'm working a lot with the symbolism of Easter, with resurrection, with other things, and then sometimes I have to use gastronomic references, because Spain is about food, good food. And for example, I described those strategies, acts of genocide in terms of ensalada rusa, yeah, the salad, which you know, salad olivier, and then the components, and then I think some metaphors, and then I also use some references to the cases in Spanish history which can be considered as genocide. And I am doing my best to speak as much possible about art and artists, because art is kind of universal language, idiom which we can use to speak about our problems. And one of the examples is, for example, one of the things which is being presented, exhibited now in Madrid. The exhibition, actually, these are rushniki, the flax linen with the pictures, and the pictures are taken from the photos of genocide in Bucha and Irpin, and you can see that they are included in the Christian background and use of Ukrainian national patterns, design colors like red, black, and white, and and I think it's a good example how we can speak about genocide. Thank you for your attention, and that's it for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to each of our 4 panelists. I know that we are eager to have a discussion among our experts that we've gathered today, as well as among our audience. So at this point, I will transition over to audience questions in the interest of time. I would invite any of our panelists, as we're representing several different viewpoints, several different disciplines, if you'd like to respond to anything that your fellow panelists have said, this would be a good time. We'll weave that into our audience question and answer session. I will read questions in the order that I receive them here in the chat. Please keep them coming. We see lots of good ones. For our panelists, if I read a question and you feel it pertains to what you've spoken about or your area of expertise, feel free to jump right in. First of all, I see Peter Lorenzi, who says, quote, "I am not familiar with international law. Is it possible, and could you imagine a, quote, peaceful resolution to the current conflict that would include absolution of accusations of war crimes, genocide, or other atrocities? Would that be a price countries would pay to achieve peace?" Certainly a challenging question. Is that something that any of our panelists would like to address?
Well, I can only say that it's too late for such a possibility to be entertained because it's already out there. And it's out there on both sides. Clearly, Ukraine made its case, although mostly it's done in a public domain, but the significant efforts are now and resources devoted to bring it to International Criminal Court and also in Ukrainian courts. And the international community also stands behind it. So there is no backtracking to placate the Russians. But the Russians reciprocated in terms of putting forward accusation of a similar nature committed by the Ukrainians, and the recent capture of the Ukrainian warriors in Mariupol indicated that some of them meant to put on trial for that kind of crime. So it's just too late to consider that kind of things. It's the train already have left the station.
That was the exact expression, the train has left the station. And as we see the International Criminal Court on the ground as well. I don't see any of our other panelists jumping in. The next question I see is from Terry Anderson, who's asking a question about, will a text version be available for this session upon its completion? I know that we're recording, so I imagine our Fulbright team will have some instructions for us there about how they might disseminate that. I'll move next to Liesl Kaufman, who wrote, quote, just before the current invasion, Putin wrote an infamous essay stating that Ukrainians as people and nation do not really exist. So this should prove intent correct. I know that this question might have come in before your talk, Myroslava. I believe that you mentioned this speech as well.
Right. I think that this speech of Putin is the text of the speech is the document from which the genocidal intent could be involved. So it is one of the proofs of the intent. However, we have many more such proofs, not only speeches, documents, but also, and these speeches, documents, they formulate the state policy, but also from facts, circumstances, consequences, all this brutality, all these atrocities which are committed against the Ukrainian national group, they prove intent of genocide. Thank you.
Would any of our other panelists like to weigh in on this infamous speech or any of the other language-related aspects? If not, I can keep moving through the chat.
Well, I just like to reiterate what I already said. In order for us to talk about a crime of genocide committed, you need to take into account all three factors: is the intended group, the act, and the protected group, the act, and the intent to destroy this group as such. So holding beliefs, no matter how pernicious they could be, no matter how ridiculous or absurd they might seem to others, is not enough, because you have to act upon it for crime to be committed. So, you know, people hold all kinds of beliefs, from religious to political, that other people consider completely unacceptable. But as long as just believe it and not act upon it, therefore there is no crime committed. So we have to differentiate between that.
Professor Serbyn, I see your hand.
Unless I missed it while it was presented by somebody, but it's also a question of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Patriarch Kirill, his role, and the clergy, the role during these events. This is a very delicate subject. I'm wondering to what extent it should be part of our analysis or in analysis in general, because the Russian Orthodox Church was always very closely integrated with the state authorities. This goes back to the Tsar's times and even before, and so on. So the role is very important. No matter what percentage of the Russian people is still faithful to the Russian Orthodox Church, but I think it does play a significant role in setting the, not the policy, but at least the interpretation of the policies to its faithful. I'm just wondering if Myroslava or Gennadi or would like to comment on that.
Miroslava, please.
Yeah, I would like to say that from my point of view, those speeches of Patriarch Cyril and clergy, the Russian Orthodox Church clergy, they might be qualified as incitement to genocide, from my point of view. And by the way, Putin's speeches and other political leadership speeches, they also are not only texts from which genocidal intent may be inferred, but they also might be used as a proof of incitement to genocide, which is also an act which is punished under the Genocide Convention, from my point of view.
I recall
as far as the Russian Orthodox Church is concerned, and it is quite often being accused of ethnophilia by its sister churches, in terms that it emphasizes the Russian statehood as a cornerstone of its operation, and since Russian regime is highly ideological regime, and part of the ideological underpinning of it is the concept of so-called Russian world propagated by the Russian Orthodox Church, which explicitly denies the separate existence of the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, insisting that they should be part of one people, and therefore implicitly and explicitly sometimes denying the need for independent, not just independent churches for those peoples, but independent statehood for those peoples as well. And the insistence of wishful thinking on their part to wish the Ukrainians and the Belarusians out of existence, that also provides evidence of intent. Since again, it's not just a church doctrine, it has been incorporated into the state policy by Moscow.
This conversation reminds me a little bit of the way that we've also looked at the Rwandan genocide, where some of the radio broadcasters who were promulgating hate speech were actually tried in courts of law for their role. And that led related fields of genocide policy scholarship to begin to talk about direct perpetrators, atrocity enablers, sort of breaking down these categories. There's a lot of complexity and kind of deep analytic waters behind what our panelists are saying. Adding to that, Peter Lorenzi has added a point to Liesel's comment, which I'll read for the group because it's getting at some of the heart of this. Peter had said, is there a critical difference between saying that a people and nation do not exist as contrasted with a belief that a people and nation should not exist, perhaps more directly implying genocide? So as I sort of ruminating for the group, I'll read Catherine Clay's comment just below this because I believe it might be related for our panelists. And she had said, isn't one rhetorical and another an advocacy for action? So again, getting, I think, at this idea of how genocide is used for these different purposes by different professional groups. Would any of our panelists like to comment on these audience questions as well?
Well, it matters who says that. You know, if some schmuck says that somewhere, even on TV, that's one thing. If it's the dictator who directs his armies into territory of sovereign independent states and tries to transform or destroy the state and transform its population into something else it does not want to be, that makes a difference. So just saying those things, just going back to it's all rhetorical until you act upon it. And if you do, then it becomes a crime.
Myroslava, did you have a point to make?
No, thank you. No, I don't. I do agree with Gennadi.
Mm-hmm. So another sort of aspect there that sometimes some genocide scholars try to get at, just to organize all of this complexity, is to ask questions of motive and means. Do the people with the means to commit the atrocities also have the motive? Exactly the sort of thinking that Gennadi's point is grounded in. Turning again to our chat, I see some comments coming through, questions about, is rhetoric a precondition for genocide? I think we touched on that. Liesl has talked about, they're both used as justifications for implementing genocide, asking if lawyers split hairs to get perpetrators off the hook. There's certainly lots of professional disagreement. I'm looking again for the next question that I see. I believe it's coming from...
I'm sorry, just brief comment on the previous one.
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely difficult to prove intent. Although in this particular case that we're discussing, I think the evidence is plentiful, but normally it's rather difficult because people who commit acts of genocide do not advertise, again, normally that's what they intend to do, while in the case of Russian leadership, it's actually not the case. However, we should not, this should not detract our attention that Moscow leadership is clearly and without any doubt liable to be charged with committing crimes of aggression, which is serious, very serious, as serious as crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity. So that is extremely easy to prove because we have the hierarchy of command. That leaves no doubt who gave order. So it's not just the Russian dictator, but the entire Russian government and the military and the propagandists and all that. So that's pretty clear. So, and we should start from that point on. So, and proving other crimes, as challenging as they are, should do everything. But that crime should not be considered like not a serious enough crime, because that is the crime I think Putin and his entourage should and will be charged first, because that's easiest to prove.
I'm sorry, dear colleagues, for taking the word. The air alert has just been announced, and I'm working as an illustration for our excellent seminar. I'm sorry, I have to go. I wish you all the best, and I thank you for excellent discussion. Be safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Thank you.
Certainly.
I wonder whether we don't have air raid siren as well. Veronica, don't we have this?
Yes, I hear there are sirens in Ivano-Frankivsk as well. But we should, I think that Ivano-Frankivsk is a relatively safe place. So I think we can.
Cross my fingers.
We really appreciate our panel gathering today, and we stand in solidarity with you with what is happening even for our panelists now. Getting to this question that I see in the chat, I'll just mention that there's questions again about if genocide, how it's proved in court. I think that has come up in our discussion as well, that there are, Michael Sforzluk was bringing up that there are other charges that might be able to be proven first. Gennadi, I think that is something that you just said as well. The next question that I see is from Victoria Rodenkova, who says, great considerations about the current situation, but can we consider the events of the previous century, like the Holodomor, the artificial famine, and others as genocide? So I think broadening the time frame of our conversation today to not just February 2022 or even 2014 to 2022, but as well as linking it back in history.
Mhm.
If I may say a few words. However, I think that there should be a separate session on this, because from my point of view, this is ongoing genocide, which started long, long ago, and even before the Holodomor genocide. That was definitely genocide, the Holodomor genocide. But the destroying of Ukrainian nation started long ago, before the Holodomor. But I do think that this is too broad a question for discussion now.
We
Well,
will have a
I
follow-up
only,
panel. We will have a follow-up panel, just letting everybody know, and Victoria will help us organize it. So certainly the seizure of grain right now in Ukraine by Russian forces and the block of the ports brings to mind a lot of what Victoria mentioned with Holodomor. But anyway.
I will encourage everyone to read a short speech by Raphael Lemkin on the Soviet genocide in Ukraine that he wrote in 1953 and widely available now, where he actually conceptualized the Soviet genocide in Ukraine and clearly puts the crime of what is nowadays called the Holodomor in the context of the Soviet genocide in Ukraine. However, explicitly in that speech, he did not equate the Holodomor, that is the death by hunger in the countryside in 1933, as genocide in itself, but as an important part of the policy of genocide. So this current Ukrainian discourse equating the Holodomor with genocide is very problematic, because essentially it neglects all other important aspects of the Soviet genocidal policies that preceded the Holodomor, ran concurrent to it, and lasted long after the Holodomor was over. So it's clearly a crime against humanity and part of larger genocidal policies of the Soviets in Ukraine.
Two comments, if I may, regarding Lemkin's article. Yes, this is a very important article. This was the first conceptualization of the Ukrainian genocide, or genocide against Ukrainians, in a total aspect of the crime. But two things you have to remember. The term Holodomor was not used then, and Lemkin never used the term Holodomor in his life, as far as I know. The Holodomor was based on the famine, the idea of Holodomor and the famine. However, when it became the word for genocide, it was broadened, and it should not be used only in the sense of Morenya Holodom, famine, any more than Holocaust is used in the sense of the destruction of the Jews by incineration. That's what Holocaust means, total burning. This is one thing that has to be kept in mind. The genocide is more than, and we would have to remember not to fall into the same fallacy with the present genocide. In other words, limiting it only to the killing part of the genocide. And the second part, the second thing about Lemkin is Lemkin's book, or rather article, was titled Soviet Genocide in Ukraine, or the Ukraine as it was called then, in Ukraine. Here, Lemkin himself limited himself unjustly, and if he had been questioned, he would have amplified on it, because the genocide was not only in Ukraine, it was also to the perhaps up to 10 million Ukrainians that lived outside the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So that should have been also included, but for various reasons, Lemkin did not include it in this article, which after all was a political article. It was not a scientific, scholarly article. It was delivered before an audience, a popular audience, not an academic gathering. So these two things have to be kept in mind when we talk about the present genocide against Ukrainians. That's why I insist that the present genocide should also be in the Ukrainians in the RF should be also included in the concept of Ukrainians as an ethnic group. Thank you.
I think we should acknowledge and recognize Dr. Serbyn, who in 2008 rediscovered Lemkin's article and made it available in Ukraine and elsewhere in English and in Ukrainian. Unfortunately, until then, his speech was not known to the public, was essentially absent from the academic discourse, and a lot of confusion concerning the concept of the Soviet genocide in Ukraine. Went awry without Lemkin's fundamental contribution into in the field. That includes the Holodomor, but not only. And another thing very, very important about this speech, he conceptualized the Soviet genocide in Ukraine within a framework of a colonial domination of Moscow in Ukraine. So to him, genocide was a colonial crime that explicitly explained in his very short speech. So I encourage everyone to read it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. It is often this idea that we look for intent through actions. We have to ask these questions about the perpetrator's motives, and there are certainly legal ways, as Miroslava is an expert on and has spoken with us about. There are also academic ways. We often don't see in archives a perpetrator saying, I am committing genocide against this group for this purpose. So we infer through using proxy variables. There are ways that we can map dynamics in the Ukrainian Holodomor and elsewhere. I cannot believe it really, because this conversation has flown by, but we are at time and we have so many wonderful questions that I know that we can save these chats. I imagine that some of the questions that we're receiving will shape our wonderful Fulbright team's thinking as they are planning these follow-up questions, because some of these questions can be events in and of themselves. So I want to thank our audience so much for the questions that you asked our panelists. The next question in line is kind of a good wrap-up question, allowing our panelists to add one closing thought here. It's from Carolyn Florenstein. I think I'll also broaden it a bit, Carolyn, if you don't mind, but you asked this question about, in terms of legal enforcement against individual perpetrators, what are the Ukrainian perspectives on the ICC and international mechanisms? So to just sort of broaden that out for all of our panelists, your perspectives on the ICC, on international mechanisms, or on perhaps other ways that international mechanisms, scholarly communities like we've gathered today, other groups can support the exploration and the documentation of this question. I'd love to have final thoughts from our panelists on this topic. Would anyone like to go first? Perhaps Miroslava, I hate to put you on the spot, but you are our legal expert here.
Yeah, I would like to answer this question. Thank you, Caroline, for asking it. And for your attention and interest in what is going, and your support. I know how much you support us. So the perspectives are optimistic. You know that ICC has already launched investigation on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and alleged crime of genocide, with a possibility thus far. So they have launched it on the initiative of 38 states, and then some more states added. So the International Criminal Court of a prosecutor has already visited Ukraine, and now the team of investigators have arrived to Ukraine, more than 40, to collect evidence of the crimes. So this case has already started in the International Criminal Court. Besides, a lot of cases have already been opened in Ukraine, in domestic jurisdiction, and in jurisdiction of other states. What concerns the International Tribunal, Ukraine initiated the idea of creating such international tribunal. You know that we cannot establish anything like Yugoslavia or Rwanda tribunal because Russian Federation is a permanent member and it would veto any resolutions of the Security Council. However, there might be some special tribunal and this is possible, and Ukraine is working on establishing such special tribunal exactly on the crimes which are committed now in the territory of Ukraine by Russian military. So perspectives are good.
I would like to add that you have to understand that such institutions as the International Criminal Court is meant to be a institution or a court of last resort. So the majority of the cases is meant to be investigated by the country on which territory those crimes are committed. I mean, obviously, in that is a capacity issue. If Ukrainian court system cannot handle it, then the ad hoc international tribunal could be set up. But that does not leave Ukraine just deferring everything to the international organization. It actually has to lift its own weight. Besides, certain crimes cannot be handled by the Ukrainian courts. For example, crimes of a war of aggression is exclusive prerogative of the International Criminal Court. It cannot be launched by national courts against other countries. So it has to be a concert. So all three avenues are, I suppose, open, but most likely it's going to be Ukrainian court system and the International Criminal Court. Ad hoc tribunals were, as the history suggests, were created in the full awareness that the country that was the victim of genocidal policy was not able to handle the cases.
If I make a short comment, in the criminal code of Ukraine, there is the crime of aggression. So Ukraine has already launched this investigation on the crime of aggression of Russian Federation. The International Criminal Court would not be able to have this case because Russia has not ratified the Rome Statute. And what concerns, you also mentioned something, the last point. The Ukraine seeks accountability in the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court has already launched investigation on the war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this is the very case in which the victim state is looking for accountability. We are asking the International Criminal Court about it. But I do agree that the International Criminal Court is complementary, has complementary jurisdiction. Still, it has launched the case of crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine.
And the crimes of the war of aggression is also purview of International Court of Justice.
It is, but Russia will never agree to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice.
Mhm.
Professor Serbyn, did you have a final comment? Professor Serbyn, did you have a final comment as I close out the panel today?
Yeah, you are muted, Professor.
Roman, you are muted.
Romana, you are muted.
Yeah, that's what people tell me. Okay, but sometimes you can speak and nobody hears you. But coming back to Earth, I think this was an excellent introduction to other conferences. I think we should continue because there's still a lot of things that we should discuss in the present situation. For example, the Latin American that was touched here, the Spanish and Latin American. At the University of Quebec in Montreal, I had an occasion to assist at some conferences where a lot of what we call the Latinos were also present and so on. And it was very interesting to discuss what were their concepts on the world situation, American imperialism as compared to Russian imperialism, their griefs against the Americans, and seeing Putin not as a new big oligarch and capitalist, but rather as a sort of a carryover from the socialist Soviet Union. See, and it's sort of it was very amusing, but at the same time, it's something that has to be addressed. And it's in this perspective, I think also that we have to see how the world is visualizing what is happening today in Ukraine. So I do look forward to other conferences that will expand on these. And the other point is the question of the audience. Who will be the audience? Ukrainian audience in Ukraine, Ukrainian diaspora, and Western, especially North American audience, the question of what language to use, and also the question of the preparation of these audience for this kind of a discussion, their background, how they visualize the world situation today. So I think this is a very interesting subject for the future as well. So thank you very much for your participation. And I'm sorry for I don't hear very well. I had the gadget to improve my hearing, but it hasn't been the miracle that I expected. And well, I have a little bit of difficulty. And I think, let's be frank, my time has come to say thank you, goodbye, and leave it to the younger generation. I mean, this is a part of human nature. So thank you very much. But I still do hope to assist at some of the conferences.
I wanted to also mention Dr. Serbyn is our honorary Canadian here, and we are interested in discussion with Dr. Baziuk about convening American and Canadian scholars together. My daughter is a dual citizen of Canada and the US, and I myself have spent a few years in Canada researching there. So it would be great to get the Canadian perspective in the room along with the American and Ukrainian. I think it would lead to fruitful discussion. So thank you, Dr. Serbyn, for being here today. We really appreciate it.
And do come to Montreal. Quebec is a bit different, and you have a lot of similarities, you know, a lot of things to learn because it's somehow a bit different. I suppose the Spanish-speaking regions of United States have similar situations, but anyway, it does broaden our outlook on the world and our concept of history and so on. And the last point, perhaps I would say, something that is very, I don't know how to say, sad, unfortunate, but at the same time, part of world history, is that genocide in the very large, broad sense is part of history, except that we don't look at it that way. But North and South America, the genocides that took place here, the invasion of one people against on the territory of other people and so on, was very often accompanied and followed by genocide and so on. Unfortunately, the thing that we have to realize now is that we want to stop this kind of a world situation. In other words, we want to get past it and say, yes, as the convention says, history was full of genocide, but we do not want to have more genocides now and in the future. So I don't know, maybe this is also, this could be a very interesting very broad topic for a conference.
Absolutely. I thank you so much for those final comments there, Professor Serbyn, Professor Antonovich, Professor Pobere̶ny, and of course, to all of our audience members. It was really, really a shame for me personally to not get to ask every one of your questions because I them coming in and they were rich and nuanced, and so we're so thankful for our audience. I'd also like to give a word of thanks to our organizers, Veronica and Maria. You put in so much work. Olena is with us today. Jessica, we thank our Fulbright team for creating this platform for what is, I think, just the first of many interesting conversations to come. On that note, I will close this event for today with the hopes of seeing each of you again at future events. And to our Ukrainians in the audience and on our panel today, I'll just end with saying that all of us are so eager to continue to support Ukraine, not only with our words through events like today, but as well as with our actions. So we look to you to help provide guidance for how best to use our energies to support you in these times, and look forward to hearing more from the Fulbright team about how they'll post the recording of this event. Fulbright team members, do you have any final words, or should I close us out today?
Дуже дякуємо.
I'm sorry, if I may, brief reminder, I appreciate everyone's interest in this topic, and I would encourage everyone, before coming to it, just take a look at the convention. I mean, just specifically the definition of these crimes. I appreciate Christina making a brief introduction to the terminology, but that is something useful for everyone, not just hear them, but have it in front of them when we discuss things of that nature. And please don't be fooled by political declaration by the parliaments and all that. You know, these are not people who are really deeply into the concepts. It's just not their business. So it's not their fault, so to speak. So as much as those declarations important, they clearly designate, they reflect the solidarity and help that Ukraine needs, all that. But that kind of pronouncement of whether something is or is not genocide or anything else for that matter, it's despite what Miroslava says that the law is not just for the lawyers, that is actually important to see that the court deal with those issues, and that has much more validity than just declaration, as much as they're important for other political purposes. Therefore, when we get engaged in matters of that nature, please look at the simplest definitions, and it would be much easier for all of us to communicate about those issues. Thank you very much for the organizers, and looking forward to continue the discussion.
Дякуємо і до зустрічі.
Дякуємо всім.
Дякую.
Дякуємо.
До зустрічі.
Зустріч.